If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
Night shifters, first responders, and cops. What strange, odd, or spooky things have you seen? Have you ever experienced anything paranormal on the job?
I used to work in a graveyard in a warehouse that used to be a high school. A student had hanged themselves from the stairwell, but it didn't hold, and she fell to the first floor and landed with a thud. Sometimes I'm the only one working in my area, so I usually bring my AirPods and listen to music. The one day I forgot them, I heard a really loud thud, like someone dropped a textbook on the ground. I went to check around to see what it was. I search everywhere but the stairwell, and when I decide to check the stairwell, I see a girl on the ground with a pool of blood around her head. I freaked out and backed away because it scared me shitless. The person who works in my area too looks at me and sees I'm sitting on the floor practically as white as snow. He asked, "What's wrong?" I couldn't get a sentence out, so I just pointed to the stairwell. There's nothing there. So I ask other people who have worked in that same area if they've ever experienced that. Only one has, and that's how I found out about the girl. It's definitely the scariest thing I've ever experienced. I was doing guard duty in the army one night. We had some training exercise in an abandoned camp facility, and my buddy and I had been assigned to watch over some vehicles that we had parked in a large empty warehouse. We were the only ones in that camp facility, as there was nothing else valuable that had to be watched overnight. My buddy and I had tied hammocks between the vehicles to get a bit more comfortable for the overnight watch when we suddenly saw a pack of wild dogs standing outside the doors to the warehouse. Now these doors were wide open, and nothing was stopping the dogs from coming in at all. But they just stood there, 15 to 20 dogs lined up at the entrance to the abandoned warehouse, watching us. Suddenly, as if someone had flipped a switch, they all started barking and howling in our direction. I say out direction because, when I discussed it later with him, we both agreed that it felt like the dogs were barking at something else in the entirely abandoned house. My buddy and I were completely terrified, first that we might have gotten swarmed by the dogs, and second, at whatever the duck those dogs were barking at. We started to radio for help, but suddenly, the pack of dogs stopped barking and left. It was as if they had never been there. That was a long night of guard duty, I can tell you. Apart from the usual voices you hear, shades you see, light cracks, creepy old buildings, etc. One night I was passing by a playground park at around 3 a.m. and spotted an adult male and what appeared to be a kid 5 to 6 years of age, both swinging in total silence on the swings you have for children. It was cold and rainy, and both of them were poorly clothed for this type of year and especially the weather. I didn't seem homeless, though. Pretty unusual stuff to do at 3 a.m. with a kid, you would say. I had lots of different things cross my mind at that moment, so I decided to take a closer look since I thought I was tripping. As soon as I got close enough for them to see me, still far from them, they just stared at me for a brief second and started running as fast as they could, again without a single word spoken, voice, or sound being made. I was not sure where they ran because I had to scratch my eyes for a second time to check if I was asleep or not. It was a what the duck, bruh moment for me. My dad was a janitor for years. He told me a couple stories. One was that when he worked at a middle school, he would go in early and clean. We're talking 5 a.m., and he'd be the only one in the whole building. Anyway, one time he goes to clean the counselor's office, which used to be a storage closet but was converted, but when he goes to unlock the door, he can't open it. The desk inside had been pushed up against the door, as if someone were trying to prevent someone from coming in. This would be no biggie, except the only way out of the office was through that very door, and there were no windows. He later heard from other staff that odd and creepy things like that would happen every so often at that school. When he used to work at an elementary school, he would stay even after the teachers would leave for the day. Often, they would say or wave bye to him as they left their classrooms, and he continued cleaning into the night hours. He remembered this one teacher who was always nice to him, and she would say, "Bye, see you tomorrow," with a smile, and she would always wear high heels that would clack 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 against the tile as she left. She died in a car accident not too long after, and my dad says that every so often, when he would stay late and clean, he could hear clack, clack, clack echoing down the long, dark hallways. I have a few. One night I was working in Porter Ranch, California. It was an outside job. It was about 3 a.m., and I looked up to my left, and there was what I can only describe as a giant, ducking cigar-shaped black blimp in the sky. It was so huge, and it looked so close. My heart dropped, and I just stared in awe. I was convinced I had just observed aliens. I would tell this story to my friends and family for years, and they would literally always laugh. Some time later, I came across an article that showed something like what I saw, and apparently it was a military blimp. It was much fatter in the sense that what I saw was elongated. At the same location another night. My routine patrols took me around the perimeter of the building, and in the back, it would overlook a bridge, the freeway, with a huge valley underneath. Throughout the entire night, I heard weird chants from a group that sounded almost satanic from under the bridge. I was a bouncer for a nightclub once. I felt really bad about this guy, who went to the same university as I did at the time. He came from a working class background, and he was working to pay off student loans and stuff. I gave him and the bartender a break by volunteering to clean up the club so they could head home early. As I was cleaning up one of the corners of the club, I saw this woman in a white nightgown standing at the bar on the other side of the room. I was a little weirded out at the time, so I called out across the club, telling her, "Ma'am, this place is closed, please leave." I was sure I locked the front of the club. I had no idea how the duck she got in there. She looked up at me, smiled, and ducked behind the table. At that point, I had no idea what to do, so I went over there and looked behind the bar, and there was no one hiding there. I called my manager, who was sitting in the upstairs office, and I asked him to review surveillance because I was sure I had seen someone. We went to the tapes, and there was no one at the bar. Apparently, I was talking to the walls. Never happened again, but it still bothers me today. I worked a graveyard shift at a tomato plant in between towns in the Central Valley of California. It's pretty much nothing out there other than a few houses pretty far from each other with some dairies and open spaces. I used to smoke, and I would watch Netflix or listen to podcasts in between rounds. There's literally no one out there at all. I worked there for a little over 5 years, and I never saw anyone walk out there. Behind the guard shack, there was an open field. I step out to smoke, and I'm watching something on my phone. I hear someone talking and laughing behind the guard shack. I dismiss it as just the wind or voices carrying from the dairy down the road. I keep hearing people laughing and giggling, so I decided to peek around the side. You have to understand that I grew up in an area that many would consider a ghetto. I grew up around gangs and then joined the military. I'm not saying I'm a tough guy by any means, but it takes a bit to scare me. Anyway, I looked around the side of the small building and didn't see much, just the open field. I take a drag from the cigarette I'm smoking and tell myself I'm hearing things. I hear giggling again and take a couple of more steps, and I swear, I almost shit myself. I see 2 little kids in the middle of the field talking and giggling together. It looked like a little boy and a little girl, no older than 7 to 10 years old. I was wondering what was going on and how they got there. I squint my eyes to make sure I'm not seeing things. All this happened within seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Like I said, I couldn't believe it. They were almost see-through, and the clothes looked old, like early 20th and late 19th century clothes. Then I noticed that it looks like they only have a body from the waist up. I can't really see their legs. Just then they got quiet, and they turned to look in my direction, almost like they realized that I was watching them. When they did that, they had no freaking eyes, just dark holes where their eyes were supposed to be. Once again, like I said, this all happened within seconds, no more than a minute after seeing them. I felt this cold feeling in my bones and seriously got freaked out and got the hell out. I threw my cigarette down, turned on all the lights and closed all the blinds, including the front blinds, to look out the guard shack. Those blinds had never been closed the whole time I worked there. I was almost shaking and felt this uneasy dread. I said a quick prayer and started trying to call my wife to see if she would pick up. Once again, I worked graveyard, and this was only about 2:30 to 3 a.m. I still had half my shift. I didn't do a single round the rest of my shift until the sun came out. I called and texted my wife, but she was out. I tried watching something funny on Netflix or listening to funny podcasts like Joe Rogan. The whole time I worked there, I never saw something like that before or after that night. I tried to look up what kids with black eyes were, but I just kept feeling the same way I felt that night and just let it go. It took me a while to process what happened that night. Every time I drive by there, I always think back to that night. Not a night guard, but I was a janitor for a little bit a while ago in a building that was only accessible by a key fob. You'd need one to get into the front door, and you'd have to use it again to enter the offices. The shift was from 4 p.m. to midnight, and if I finished early, I got to leave while still being paid until midnight. Each night I'd hang out with my coworkers in the office until 5 p.m., then we'd all head out to our buildings. I'd empty all the trash bins first, vacuum and mop where needed, take care of any scheduled cleanings like steam cleaning the curtains, and I'd hit the bathrooms last since everyone would normally be out of the office at that time. Most nights, I was finished between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. There was a night when I was finishing up, and all I had to do was clean the bathrooms. I did the woman's room without any issues, and then I headed into the men's room. When I went in, the lights turned on because of that sensor, and there was some man I had never seen before just standing in the middle of the bathroom. I have no idea who he was or how long he was in there, but he had to have stood still long enough for the lights to go off and then remain motionless so they wouldn't turn back on. When I saw him, I just turned around and left for the night. So where we work, part of the job description is taking turns watching the camp at night, making sure nothing crazy happens. Anyway, to set the scene, we'll call my coworker Joe. Joe was leading his group of young boys through the desert mountains of some Native American land. They had been walking since sunup and had run out of water. The sun was setting, and they needed to find shelter and water. One of our rules is that we don't hike at night because it has proven dangerous. Anyway, as desperation set in and the sun began disappearing behind the horizon, Joe's group stumbled upon a diamond-shaped puddle in the ground. Strangely, it seemed like water was rising from this spot as if it were a spring. Next to this puddle was a dry, open field with a peculiar altar in the middle. There was nothing on it yet. Out of necessity, they camped there that night. Joe took the first night watch. He felt as if something was watching him, and though we're not supposed to use our headlamps except for emergencies, he constantly scanned the field with them to make sure nothing was there. It eventually ran out of batteries. Near the end of his night watch, this cold chill ran up his spine, and the feeling came strongly that something didn't want him there. He glanced into the field, finding two angry red eyes in the distance. He was terrified, but he finished his shift. When he woke up the next person to take the shift, he did what most of us coworkers would have done, crawled into his sleeping bag, saying to himself, "Valp, hopefully that doesn't kill us." And I tried to sleep. The next morning, he woke up and counseled with our coworkers. They all said they saw the same thing. The group walked over to the altar, where a rabbit was freshly torn in half. Back when I was a captain in the fire department, we responded to a house fire early in the morning. When we arrived, the roof was breached, and flames had taken out 2 windows on the second floor of a split-level home. We made entry, and even though the roof was breached, the thermocline was about 2 feet off the first floor. We wouldn't have gone in at all, but a child was missing, and the father and mother had gotten out of the house, but they couldn't get to their daughter's room. The father was being treated for burns on his hands and forearms, as he had tried to go in after her. Suffice it to say, they were frantic. They told us that her room was on the second floor, with the second door on the right. Simple enough. We made entry, and the stairs faced the door. Rapid bursts from the TFT to the ceiling brought the smoke level up to about 4 feet from the floor. That's when my hand lineman and I saw something that neither of us could explain. I saw motion to my left down on the main floor. Someone was walking around downstairs. I pointed to my hand lineman, and he saw it too. We couldn't see a body as the person was in the smoke, but we could see the legs and the feet clearly. It looked to be a man wearing olive green trousers and leather shoes. I wouldn't say that the legs were dancing, but they were certainly moving in a way to get our attention. We redirect back down the stairs and see the legs go into a door on the right side of the small hallway. We both saw the legs go into that room. We get down the hallway, and the door is closed. Feeling the door, there weren't flames behind it, and we made entry to discover that we were in a bathroom. The light was on, and curled up in the bathtub was the little girl. There was no one else in the room with her. We broke out the window and got her to a second crew, keeping the house next door from catching fire. We looked around the bathroom again and couldn't find the man we'd both seen going into the bathroom. There was no place for him to hide in there. We withdrew from the house and did exposure control as the house was a complete loss with the fire already ingressing into the living room. The parents had gone with their daughter to the hospital, where she was seen a ghost during a response. I worked security at this college, and they had me patrol 3 in the morning. Now, I didn't mind, and the scariest places on the campus weren't awful, but this one time, I was definitely creeped out. The night before, I decided to watch The Grudge with my buddy, and that freaked me out for the rest of the day. I wake up the next morning around 2:20 a.m., get dressed, and go to work. When I got to the campus, the dispatcher had me patrol inside a couple of the facilities. Before I even got to the first building, I was walking and kept hearing rustling in the bushes. I looked around and saw nothing, but right as I arrived at the first building, I looked down one of the walkways between 2 of the buildings and saw this tall, long-haired, dark-headed individual just standing 25 yards away from me. I began to call out to it to see if it was just some college kid, but there was no answer. Without a second thought, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in the direction, but no one was there. I looked around for a bit, but I just thought to myself that I saw a shadow. I opened the front door of the first building and check everything like usual. Because of the size of the building, I couldn't turn the lights on from anywhere close, so I usually patrolled in the dark. That morning, Nothing was out of place, and I was able to make it out in pretty good time. I would always use the elevator to get to each floor, so once I was done, I took the elevator to the ground floor, did emergency phone checks on both, and walked to my last assignment for the building. Once I finished checking the north wing of the building, I walked back to the entrance until I heard a loud bell sound come from the elevator. This noise is always rung when the elevator reaches a floor, but I previously looked at both elevators and saw they were on the ground floor already. Without looking behind me, I straight up ran to the front doors in the lobby. Once I was safely out, I flashed my light inside to check, but there was nobody there, and the elevator doors were all shut. This had never happened before. While it was creepy, I still managed to keep my composure and move on to the next task. Once I reached the other building, I did the same things as previously done with the other building. For this particular facility, it is a well-known fact that the inside makes noises. It was always creepy in the beginning, but you would get used to it. However, this morning was different. After I finished checking all of the exterior doors, I made a quick elevator phone check and began to walk out when I heard this loud thump from upstairs. I grabbed my flashlight and started to yell out, "Hello?" multiple times, but there was no answer. At this point, I was scared out of my mind, so I made my way to the exit when I saw, out of the corner of my eye, the same strange figure I saw in the walkway up top on the second floor peering down at me. The same very tall figure with long, dark hair, this time with a white gown. After seeing her or it, I feel my teeth start to chatter, and I run out of the building all the way to the security office and report my findings. My dispatcher only shrugged it off, but I was still terrified for the next couple of hours until daylight. I actually worked for a security company on a casual basis for a while a few years ago. Without doubt, the creepiest thing happened one night when I was checking a number of premises in an industrial park. This park was on the outskirts of town and already had a pretty eerie vibe at night when it was totally deserted. The job was simply checking that all the doors were locked and nobody was snooping around. This still freaks me out a bit to think about it, but during the last inspection, I was walking around a building and I heard faint laughter. I stopped still and listened to hear where it is. It continues and sounds like a child or even a baby laughing. At this point, I'm a little freaked out and decide to continue to loop around the building and leave. As I'm walking around the building, I swear I can hear the sound of children's footsteps following me and the sound of very young kids laughing. I turn around and search with my flashlight, but nobody is around. I just nope the duck out of there. I was an EMT, then a paramedic for 8 years before becoming an RN. It's a decent-sized city with 100,000 plus citizens and loads of weird history. This is the story I will never forget. There was one house we would go to regularly that was beyond haunted. I don't know who or what lived and died there before the present patient. There were mannequins in the living room. Several. I never asked because I didn't want to be in there any longer than necessary. The first time we were called there, I stood on the stoop, trying to will my body to go in. The atmosphere was intimidating. It almost felt like the house was saying, "Come in if you dare." My partner was male, so I thought, we'll be fine. I'm a 5 feet 4 inches female, and I can hold my own in a bar fight. Threatening presences I cannot see are another story. We get to our patient, and as I'm hooking up the EKG, someone backs into me, knocking me off the balls of my feet, squatting next to the couch. I tell my partner to back up, and he says, "From what?" I look up, and he's on the other side of the couch, nowhere near me. So, I turn around. There's nothing there, but I'm eyeballing these mannequins up against the wall, a good 15 to 20 feet away. I go back to what I'm doing, and again, I'm knocked over. I tell my partner to knock it off, now he isn't even in the room. He's wandered to the kitchen to gather her medications. Now I'm on my feet. There is no way this happened twice for nothing. I turn back to these mannequins again. One has shifted slightly away from the wall, now standing with a shoulder to it, when before its back was against it. I asked the patient a bit too late if anyone else was in the home. Scene safety should have been first, but yeah. Oops. She said no, it was just her and her cat. Thinking this cat must be a puma or something, I start to look for it. Unfortunately, Peanut was no bigger than my American size 7 foot. I had only ventured to the hallway, maybe 10 feet from the couch, but out of view from the mannequins. When I walked back into the living room, that damn mannequin was now facing me. Every hair on my body stood up. Nope. Not today, Satan. We package her up, get her in the truck for transport, and haul ass from that tiny house. Lo and behold, dispatch sends a request to my tablet for an explanation of a long scene. I had to put harassed by mannequins in a run ticket without looking like I needed to be on a 72-hour emergency order of detention for a psychological evaluation. I went back to that house 3 more times that month. I called from the door for her to come to me. I may be blonde, but I am far from stupid. I work as a nurse at a hospital in the UK that was initially constructed during World War II and was supposed to be a temporary facility. However, that was not the case, and it was further built upon and still remains as a slightly modernized building. I recall doing a night shift during the winter and having a patient admitted to us with an infection but otherwise having no illnesses that could affect their cognitive function, i.e., dementia, learning difficulties, etc. At around 2:30 a.m., said patient began to scream from the side room that they were placed in. Myself and another nurse responded. Once in the room, I tried to defuse the situation and calm the patient down. All the while, the patient was screaming about how a man with a bag over his head had been standing at the end of the bed watching her. As we entered the room, I could tell something was off and felt a shift in energy, despite myself telling the patient that there was nothing to be concerned about. Once settled, myself and the other nurse that came with me turned to leave the room and witnessed what I can only describe as a shadowy figure pass through a set of double doors outside the side room in which the patient resided. The doors are behind a bit of an alcove, so you can't see them from the side room, but once you leave the room, you can see them. After a few seconds, both myself and the responding nurse clicked on to the fact that the double doors are always locked and have to be unlocked with keys. The time it took for us to see the figure pass through that area and how long it would take to unlock said doors, pass through them, and lock them again from the other side would be near impossible. Therefore, we both came to the conclusion that it was a ghost or entity of some sort, and we returned to the desk somewhat unnerved. The hospital I work at has its fair share of ghost stories, and this one is one of 3 experiences I have had personally during my 5-year stay with this hospital in particular. My brother is a firefighter. A few years ago, he responded to a call about a house fire. The neighbor had called in, saying the vacant house for sale next door was on fire. The houses weren't too far apart, but not close enough where you could clearly see through the windows. The operator did tell them that you could hear his wife in the background yelling about seeing someone in one of the upstairs windows, but she seemed rather angry, saying it was all the trash causing the fire to get worse. So my brother and his co-workers arrived and were able to put it out. He said that there was no one inside, but it looked like there had been a squatter living upstairs. So it was believed that the squatter caused the fire by accident in the bedroom upstairs, and he or she left after the wife saw him or her through the window. End of story, right? Nope. The damage wasn't terrible, so the house was eventually fixed and put back on the market. A young couple bought it, and after a few months, the police responded to a call on the house from the same neighbors. The same man who called last time called about hearing screaming inside, and the operator said she could hear the wife in the background yelling about the woman puking everywhere. It ended up being a case of domestic violence, and things were handled accordingly. Apparently one of the cops went over to talk to the neighbors about what they'd heard and question how his wife had seen the woman puking when that didn't happen near the windows, and the blinds were mostly shut. The guy looked confused and said he didn't have a wife, he never had a woman living there. The recording of the 911 call was played back, and sure as shit, a woman was heard in the background. This story got back to my brother, and he did some digging. There was only one thing he could find that would give any sort of answer. The reason the house was put up for sale was because the middle-aged woman who owned the house before had died in the house. He actually asked the neighbor about her, and he said she was a very neat person, almost OCD about everything. So when I was younger, I didn't really know what to do as a job. Being a naturally large guy, everyone always joked that I'd make a great security guard. Well, I ended up listening. My job was mostly at night, going to buildings where the alarm was triggered. Weird stuff happens all the time, but this one really had me creeped out. It was like 12:30 a.m., and my shift just began. I immediately had to follow up on an alarm at a school. So I went there and first checked the outside. There was nothing unusual or weird to see, so it was safe for me to go inside without calling in the police. For those who don't know, in an alarm system, you can see certain zones that were triggered. We had them mapped out so we'd know where to look. Here, the alarm went off in the first floor hall. I turned on some lights and walked upstairs. I checked out the alarm sensor and didn't see any dust or something that could have triggered it. My eye spotted a book laying in the middle of the hall. I didn't think much of it was fair. I've seen weirder things than a book. I pick up the book and lay it on a nearby shelf just before I reset the alarm and head back out. The moment I sit back in my car, I hear the noise of the alarm being triggered again. I didn't think anything of it since it's pretty common for sensors to just have issues. But before I surpass the sensor, I'll have to check again. I head upstairs to check the same sensor, and the damn book is lying in the same spot where I first picked it up from the floor. Needless to say, I bolted down, surpassed the alarm system with all risks included, and got the hell out of there. I never told anyone. Years later, I was talking to a colleague who sounded all panicky on the phone when he started telling me the exact same thing happened to him at the exact same school. He was terrified. I'm glad I changed jobs now. You never have to deal with haunted places anymore. Now, back in my days as an officer, I've seen some spooky stuff go down. Occasional unexplained phenomena, impossible occurrences, bizarre creatures, and hundreds of other things. However, one that sticks with me was when I went to patrol a small area in Illinois, known as Ursa. This was in 2012, so maybe a couple thousand people were living there, but that was enough people to have their own urban legend, aka the Screamer. The Screamer was supposedly a man that would randomly appear near abandoned buildings and let out a scream that would forever ring through your soul, a never-ending, piercing scream. Supposedly. I, of course, thought that this was ludicrous mumbo-jumbo. A screaming man appearing out of thin air? Absolutely not. Not even in my wildest dreams. But I was eventually proven wrong. Now, in Ursa, there is an extremely unknown location known as Dwight's Pool, a very serene, remote pond with a small asylum facing away from it, towards the main town. I was sent there by the local dispatch team, I was a floater at the time, to check out 2 reports of a man with a weird mask watching young couples swimming from the tree line. My first thought was, Valp, we've got ourselves another creep, and I believed myself to be right, as well as my temporary partner Ricky. He and I got out there immediately, as the town was too small for constant watch. Well, it's around 8:45 p.m., and the pool is eerily foggy and dark. We have flashlights, but they were unable to penetrate the thick fog. I told Ricky that I'd check out the asylum and its surroundings. He agreed, but not before long, he began acting strangely. Winger, I'm getting a weird feeling. We need backup, don't go near that asylum. Now, when you hear your own partner say stuff like that, you definitely need to take it seriously, especially as an officer of the law. He calls in backup while I watch the asylum, just waiting for something to happen. I literally gasp as I see the figure of an incredibly large man emerge from the roof of the building. The building was at least 300 feet away from us, so that's what makes this part so much stranger. The figure stands as tall as it can and begins talking in a low, mumbled tone, "Please, leave." The figure, as I said, was at least 300 feet away. However, when it said those words, its voice seemed to be pressed right against our ears. Ricky and I booked it out of there and back to the local station. Backup arrived for us later, but we were too shaken up to continue our duty. We found out later that when the dispatch searched the asylum, they found a camera and an old lantern. Nothing else. Anyway, this was definitely one of the weirder experiences I've had during my time as a patrol officer. It is but one of several odd stories I have, and trust me, in the line of an officer, things just keep getting weirder and weirder. When I worked security, for a while I did a mobile graveyard shift, where I'd drive the company car, usually a Mustang, all night from 10 p.m. until 6 p.m., checking various businesses and construction sites. There was one place, a metal and piping plant, that was one of my hits. This place has had multiple robberies since it's a very open plant with tons of stuff just laying around, plus a stabbing. One night I was patrolling it on foot, because they wouldn't let us have a key to the gate, and saw what I swear was a bear or a very large person moving between a couple huge stacks of pipes. I said F this and turned back to my car, and to make me more on edge, before I got to the gate where my car was parked, I saw 2 massive glowing eyes staring at me from the edge of the compound where it meets the brush. I don't know if it was the same thing I saw earlier, I don't know if that thing from earlier was human or not. I didn't care and got out of there, and despite them not allowing us to carry guns, I took my gun with me from then on because Utah has an open carry law. I wasn't going to patrol that site again without protection. Thankfully, I never saw anything else there again. And I did a lot of graveyard shifts at construction sites, and there's nothing creepier about walking through a building being constructed in either sketchy places or out in the middle of nowhere, in total darkness, with nothing but a flashlight and an imagination.
Fresno County, November 2015. Around 3 a.m. a medic on an ALS unit, was working my normal 7 p.m. shift when I was dispatched to a Code 3 cardiac arrest for a suicide hanging around 3 a.m. The call info only showed that the PT
was a 34-year-old male, hanging, and the sheriff/PD was on scene. The location was in the more desolate farm properties in the valley, no street lights, just dark, cold, and engulfed in dense fog during the winter. Rolling up, I see a man, dressed head to toe in black shoes, black pants, black long-sleeve shirt, black beanie, in handcuffs, sitting on his hands with 2 sheriffs or officers surrounding him, a female and two very young kids by the house front door, and a broken rope noose on the ground underneath this oddly large, wicked-looking, gray skeleton of a tree. He had a small laceration and a rope burned to his neck, but he was very much alive. When looking at him, his eyes had little of the white and were black. He was quiet until I sat him on the ambulance gurney. The man was sobbing, trembling, and screaming that he can't take it anymore. As I was putting on our leather restraints on his wrists, I noticed he had deep horizontal cutting scars along both of his wrists. He was only trembling now, as if he were scared. All I could feel was cold. This man was struggling, and he decided that night he would give up and end it all, leaving his wife, girlfriend, and two children behind. This is where it gets freaky. I have never seen anything like this or heard of an experience like mine. 3 years later, and it still gives me chills every time I think about this. On the way to the hospital, a few good miles down the road, we made a wrong turn, got a little lost, and took a back road. He was quiet and trembling. He wasn't fighting the restraints, he almost seemed to feel safer in the back of the ambulance while I concluded, assessing that I got this bone-chilling shiver down my spine. I looked out the window and saw this house. Mind you, every house is acres apart from one another. Well, the house was okay, like the others, it looked normal, but next to this house was this big tree or bush, and in a separate tone and position, this old 4-door sedan was parked. The car looked out of place and was clearly separated from the house and tree/bush, it was like its own place. It was odd and creepy. I could normally see the headrest of the driver's seat from afar, but this car was pitch black on the inside, almost as if the darkness was coming out of the windows because it was the deepest and darkest black I had ever seen on the inside. All I saw inside was the deepest and darkest black, and two neon dark blue eyes staring back at me a little above were tall and big men's eyes in a car. I immediately felt the back of the ambulance get colder, and the goosebumps and hair on my skin stood up. At first, I thought it was a security light or reflection in the car, but as we passed the house, the car turned on, pulled out, and started following us in the ambulance. The neon blue eyes were still there, and the cabin was still as dark as it could be. The car followed us miles to the highway, still with the eyes staring and the deepest, darkest black in the cab. Even with the street lights, I could not see into the car. I was almost mystified by this and forgot about my patient in the ambulance and her partner, but I did not at all feel welcomed by these neon dark blue eyes. It was almost threatening and felt as if it wanted my PT. We were on the highway, and this car was still following us for almost 20 miles now. The neon dark eyes were still there, and even with the highway lights, I could not see into this car. It got colder. I started to feel as if it noticed me watching and was watching and focusing on me now instead of focusing on my PT. The car then sped up and pulled up next to the ambulance in the next lane while we were driving and looked at me. I was very literally 5 feet from this car and could not see into the cab from the window. All I could see were those dark neon blue eyes and darkness, but it wasn't looking ahead, it was looking at me. And in that moment, I said out loud, challenging it, "Go away. You are not touching this man. This man is my patient. If you want him, you will have to come through me. I am stronger than you, and I will not let you have him." After I said that, not even a moment later, the car and my ambulance split off as it went on one ramp and I did the other. It was no longer cold in the ambulance, and my patient was no longer gray in the cheeks, but now his cheeks were pink and normal. It wasn't until after the call that we got the PT inside the hospital that I realized what just happened. I truly felt that whatever the deep neon blue-eyed thing was not human, and it wanted that man. I never believed in the paranormal, demons, spirits, or anything else that wasn't hardcore science until I experienced this. I haven't had an encounter like that again, and I hope I never do. I do not know if that man is still alive or what his outcome was, but all I know is what I experienced and saw that night. Police officer, Troy, Alabama. I had been working the third shift, from 10:30 p.m. to 6:30 a.m., for a few years and was on patrol one night. It was around 3 a.m., and it was a slow night, so I was checking buildings and cruising areas where people tend to be when they shouldn't be. One of the areas where we would have problems with people dig features, and the figure was just a black haze, and it actually turned slightly towards me as it kept walking. Now I also want to note that this was in the spring, and would always be on the ground during this time. I got out of my patrol car, and the figure never appeared from behind the tree, even though the path it had been on should have. So I got back in and drove down to the area where I had observed the figure. Once I got close to the tree, 20 yards or so, I stopped and got out. Now this area was totally grass, and there was a heavy layer of dew that night on the ground. There were no footsteps anywhere. The only tracks were my own from me walking around that tree, trying to get my brain to figure out what I saw. I radioed my buddy to come to the cemetery, and I would explain more when he got here. I told him the story, and he was walking around too, and we found nothing. This was not surprising to him since we had both been on night shift for years and we had both seen weird lights and noises, both outside and in buildings, but this was my first time seeing some figures. Also, this was the longest observation I had ever had. Several years ago, we, Belarusian ufologists, received a phone call from worried people. They told us they had a nightmare in their house. Objects began to ignite all over the house. In different parts of the house, words appear, laid out with matches. Suddenly, many broken chicken eggs began to be found on the floor. We drove 500 kilometers and found this house. The whole family has already met us on the threshold. The husband and wife are 35 to 38 years old and have 2 children. People are absolutely ordinary, with cats, cars, and computers. And what we did not like at once was that they were very frightened. And with some inexplicable hope, they looked at the pile of measuring instruments that we brought with us. Miracles began from the moment when both mother and son had strange dreams. Mother saw in a dream that her old house was constantly striking a lot of lightning, and then the house flared up from fire like a huge torch. The child had a dream in which he lied and burned in his bed. He did not feel the pain and fear, but the child remembered the impression of contemplating the burning of his body for a long time. And then, in the house, the spontaneous ignition of pieces of furniture has begun. There was a real fire show with a periodicity of 2 to 3 days. And although at the same time someone was present in the house, nobody saw the moment of the start of the fire. People felt the smell of burning, noticed smoke, and ran up to a small light emanating from the sofa, then from the curtain. Burns from these fires were found everywhere. We have dozens of photos. Later, all the furniture damaged by the fire was thrown out of the house and into the backyard. But some things caught fire in the backyard. That sack with wet hay, the firewood, and then the toy thrown into the grass. With one bag, the family was particularly worn out. Within an hour, it caught fire 5 times. Then, when everything was over, people decided to burn this bag forever but could not do it. Wet hay refused to fire up from the matches. We went into a former house, which now represents just a storehouse for all household rubbish. Items in this house burned more often and burned long and hard. People called fire brigades when this house started a fire. Firefighters said that they did not install the original source of the fire. Frightened people called for help from anyone they could. A priest came from the local church, but to the regret that his prayers did not profit, came the sorcerer, who for $3,000 said he would settle all the issues with an angry brownie. But incidents of ignition continued. The father of the family somehow shouted into the emptiness, "What do you want from us?" The next morning, after these questions, the word food was put on the windowsill. And a broken chicken egg appeared next to the word. Since then, every day, the wife leaves a freshly broken egg on this window. So the household gradually began to communicate with the poltergeist. Sometimes he answered questions. To the question of who you are, the answer was she, and the offer to leave the house was ha. When one neighbor tried to drive out the demon through some unusual ceremony, the inscription Julia, the fountain appeared on the floor. We, too, did not believe in such a matched chat until we saw the word that appeared on the night of our absence. We have a photo with this word. We left this house in the evening, stayed at the hotel, and came again in the morning. Nobody came to the closed old house, but a new word appeared. Still, there were matches scattered on the floor in various places. For the night, we left the video cameras, but at night in the whole village, electricity was lost and our cameras did not record anything. We could not verify this information, and the cameras can be turned off by people. The family appearance of the word was not surprising. Then the family's wife showed us the cat, Tikin, who somehow burned his mustache. But the burning cat was quickly noticed and extinguished. The whole day, we conducted a comprehensive study of the house with various devices, interviewed neighbors, and interviewed eyewitnesses to ignitions. In total, there were 10 people who took part in extinguishing foci of fire. All of them swear that the fires began on their own and sometimes simultaneously in different parts of the yard. We collected a lot of interesting information, video stories, recordings on the recorder, and took samples of burned furniture that appeared to match. Part of the evidence will be studied by our friends, the criminalists. In any case, we gave the family many useful tips and recommendations. First of all, they advised them to stop being afraid, because if it were an angry creature from a parallel world or intrigues a local village sorcerer, they all eat the same energy of human fears. I worked nights. While on duty, it was an extremely slow night. The only thing out were the stars. There was fresh snow on the ground. There were no street lamps or lights of any sort. That's why I liked it. Every cop has their own secluded spot on patrol. Well, Mine was an abandoned campsite. Anytime I needed to think or finish some paperwork, I would go there. I would go there frequently, so I felt comfortable there. Not on this night. As I was sitting there, I felt as if I were being watched. I felt extremely uneasy. I would check my mirrors every 30 or so seconds because of it. And if I wanted to look out the window, I would press the brake because it was dark enough that the red light would show the surroundings. Finally, I started focusing on my paperwork and not on my paranoia. About 10 minutes go by. Rapidly, my car started shaking violently, as if someone or something were trying to tip it over. My paperwork, food, and duty gear were flying all over my vehicle. I couldn't see anything, so I did what anyone else would do and put the car in drive, and I sped out of there as fast as I could. I drove to the place with the most lights I could find. I didn't want to be in the dark. I tried to make sense of it, but how could something be that close to the car? I did not see it. We have elk and bears where I live, so that had to be it, right? When I stopped freaking out, I got out of my vehicle to assess the damage. The force that moved the car had to leave a dent or scratches. When I looked, both sides of the rear of the vehicle were covered in handprints. I freaked out. No one ever goes out there. I called another buddy on his phone to come take a look. From what I described, he was just equally freaked out. We both gathered up the courage to go back and look for footprints in the snow. When we get there, all you see is my tire tracks and not a single footprint. I haven't gone back since, and I never will. My wife is a paramedic in northern Ohio and has tons of stories about weird and random paranormal shit she's experienced, but this one didn't happen at work. We were renting out an old Victorian house in the Wellington/Oberlin area. It was a beautiful old house with too much room for just the three of us. The first few months were awesome, and everything felt like home. Well, one night my daughter, 4 years old at the time, had recently gone to bed. My wife, who was home that night, happened to be heading down the hall to the bathroom while passing my daughter's room. She overheard her speaking to someone but heard no one else. She peeked in and just saw my daughter sitting up in bed talking to someone as if they were at the end of her bed. She asked her what she was doing, and my daughter just laid back down and passed out. The following morning, she asked our daughter if she was talking to anyone in her room last night, and my daughter said yes, she's really nice and wanted to sing me a song. She just went back to coloring her book. A few weeks passed, and my wife and I could hear my daughter down the hall. Bedroom doors are the only doors we keep open at night, giggling, talking, or singing along, but every time we would go in to see what was up, she'd quickly lay down and pretend she was asleep. It started to get bothersome because I wasn't sure if she was just being a goofball and randomly talking to herself or if she was legit talking to someone or something. I got a call one night, and my wife just sounded bewildered and went on to tell me that while she was downstairs, she heard our daughter screaming. She rushed up there and saw my daughter lying on the floor beside her bed blankets, all crying and saying she didn't want to go, and the lady at the end of her bed began to pull her feet and drag her off the bed. My wife asked who she was talking about and said the lady's name was Anna. And Anna got upset when my daughter told her she didn't want to sing the song anymore. My wife asked what song she was singing, and my daughter started singing Around the Rose while moving her hand in a circular motion and doing what looked like a star design in the center. My wife grabbed one of the coloring books and asked my daughter to draw the pattern on paper. My daughter agreed, and she drew up a star with a circle around it. We moved our daughter's bed into our room until we got all this sorted out. I contacted my landlord the following morning and asked if there was anything strange that's ever happened here, and he said, "Why? What did you see?" Which drove my curiosity up the wall. I told him what had been going on with my daughter, and he said that this wasn't the first time this lady had been seen. He also said that in the early 1940s, a family of 5 lived here and apparently committed suicide by poison and hanging themselves, and that he had been having trouble renting out to anyone and that nobody stayed longer than 3 months. We ended up breaking the lease 3 months later, and still to this day, my daughter sleeps with a nightlight on and has asked us to check on her throughout the night. My dad's a cop, as well as my cousin, and they've told me plenty of stories. My dad's also had an experience at a hotel he worked at as a security guard. I'll try to be brief, but there are quite a few stories to get through. 1. My dad used to work at the Fairmont Chateau Laurier in Ottawa, Ontario. The place is rumored to be haunted, and he swears it's true. He described to me a strange encounter he'd had while wandering through a part of the hotel that was meant to be closed off to the rest of the guests. It was around 3 a.m., a creepy time, right? When he noticed a woman at the end of the hallway adjacent to him. She was dressed in early 1900s style fashion, and she was walking away from him. He walked towards her to tell her that she couldn't be on this floor. He called after her, saying, "Ma'am, this floor is off limits," but she never turned around or responded. He almost caught up to her when she turned down another hallway. When he made his way around the corner, there was not a single person down the entirety of the hallway, which was too long for someone to disappear down the end in a few seconds. She also couldn't have gone into any of the rooms, as they were locked and not in use. 2. A close family friend has had an experience there as well, which she told us all about. At this point, the precinct being haunted was common knowledge to all the friends and family of those working there or people who were held in the cells. She was at home when she got a call from a strange number comprised entirely of sixes. She sees the screen light up and reads, but only whole numbers are sixes, and she's horrified, but she just watches it until it stops ringing. Literally 5 minutes later, she gets a call from her friend who's a cop, and she says, "Let's smudge the police station, we have to do something about this thing," which she agrees to. The phone call made sense to her now because she claims that once a spirit knows that someone is trying to drive it away, it tends to fight back harder, using fear to keep people from coming near. She gets her smudge, shell, and eagle feather ready, and they go to the police station that day. They smudge the entire place, feeling its presence the entire time. She said it felt angrier and angrier as they moved throughout the precinct, making more noise and even closing the door on them at one point. They saved the cells for last, knowing that would be the most difficult place to cleanse, but they weren't entirely successful. They got into the cell area, and immediately they felt like it was much harder to breathe. The sage kept trying to extinguish it, so they had to blow on it more just to keep it alive. The lights went out, and the shell holding the sage cracked in half. That's when they got the heck out of there, hoping what they did was enough. Typically, the signs that you're dealing with a particularly strong entity are when the sage wants to extinguish and when the shell cracks in half. This is the more serious sign. When this happens, you have to hold the shell together until you get away from whatever you are trying to get rid of, and then bury the shell in the earth. They did this, but it hasn't seemed to work. She realized later, though, that they cleared the building wrong. They moved through the building in a sporadic fashion, going from the outside in when you're actually supposed to move through the building in one clean sweep, closing doors behind you as you clear a room, eventually ending at the entrance of the building since the goal is to drive it out. 3. My dad also met a long-distance cyclist along the highway that passes through our town. Someone reported this guy for sitting on the side of the road. Lol, lame reason to call the cops. Anyway, the guy was just taking a break, but he began to tell my dad a story about something he'd experienced while biking. He was cycling through RTE 117 in Quebec when he made it to the top of a hill. Once he got over, he saw something walking, and he stressed walking, across the road ahead of him. He immediately stopped his bike, too scared to keep going and not wanting it to see him. He crouched down and just watched this huge thing, covered in fur, walk upright like a human across the highway and into the woods. He said he waited a good 30 minutes before even continuing on his bike ride. 4. They've also gotten a lot of calls to people's homes describing paranormal experiences to them. Of course, everything stops when they arrive, but the stories are pretty wild. There was one time a lady called 3 nights in a row, each time complaining of the same thing. She said there was knocking outside each of her windows, all at the same time. She assumed it was a group of teenagers playing pranks on her, but when the cops would arrive, no one would be there. They'd do a quick scan of the woods and the areas around her house, but they never found so much as a footprint. On the 3rd night, they arrived at the same situation. This time, the neighbor came walking over, pale as a ghost and clearly terrified. He asked, "Is this about the knocking?" And they said, "Yeah, did you see anything?" He did see something, and he told them the story. He said he'd come outside for a cigarette on his front porch when he started hearing knocking. He looked around to see where it was coming from when he saw a black figure standing outside the window of his neighbor's house. It knocked on the window a few times before taking off and running in circles around the house, too fast for any human, knocking on every window and door. He said it did this around 4 times before running across the street and into the woods. It went behind a tree and then peeked out from behind, looking directly at the neighbor with eyes that were yellow and reflective like a cat's, and then it smiled at him. There were also multiple sightings of this thing around the res for a while. I remember it being the talk of the town, but the cops never saw it, they would just get all the calls about it afterwards. So yeah, that's all I can think of right now. We live on an Indian reservation, though, and I feel like more paranormal shit happens here than it does in other places. I've worked security on and off for several years to supplement my income, so I've heard quite a few creepy stories from coworkers. Probably the most legitimately scary story I've heard was from a guard who was working in a closed-down arena. The building is more than 100 years old but hasn't been used since the early 2000s. The city is keeping up with basic maintenance as it waits for a buyer. There's usually one guard assigned to the building. It's a 6,000-seat arena with a huge basement and 2 additional floors that have lots of old office spaces, dressing rooms, and a separate, smaller community theater type stage that's upstairs. The usual guard is doing his rounds through the building. The building itself is very interesting, as it's largely unchanged since the heydays of the 1970s and 1980s. The upper floors are largely dark and are pretty creepy. Anyway, the guard is doing his normal rounds but feels unnaturally creeped out. It's his normal post, but something feels different today. He's feeling jumpy, but he shakes it off and continues. He's a very diligent guy, so he walks every floor of the building. He's at the very top of the catwalk system, above the main arena, where the old spot lighting equipment was. It's a narrow wooden catwalk system. Suddenly, he hears a loud creak behind him, like someone is walking. He spins around and sees a guy standing there. The guy is frozen in mid-stride, like he's been tiptoeing up behind him. Guy has an unsettling, mischievous-looking smile on his face, like he's been caught with his hand in a cookie jar. Dude has a big steel pipe in his hand instead of a cookie, though. The guard pulls his gun, and the guy takes off running in the opposite direction and disappears into the labyrinth of the building. The cops come and sweep the building with a K9, but they don't find him. They do find that he's been playing in the dust that's on top of the old concession counters. He had written a bunch of bizarre helter-skelter type unsettling rhymes and drew a bunch of stick figures hanging from nooses. The speculation is that it was some crazy homeless guy who had been hiding in the building for a few days and had made a game of following the guards without them knowing it. I saw the writing still on the counters the last time I was there. I was a 911 dispatcher and communications officer for a rural sheriff's department. Normally, when we get a call on 911, our Ani/Ali would populate with a number and address, though sometimes these weren't accurate or correct, especially if the caller used a cell phone, so we would always verify the address with the reporting party before sending any units out. Still, we could tell based on the first 3 numbers if it was a landline, which usually had the correct address. One night, I was working a graveyard shift, and I was by myself. I got a 911 call, and oddly, it didn't populate a phone number at all, but it did populate an address into our CAD, computer-aided dispatch, system. When I answered 911, "What is the address of your emergency?" All I heard in response at first was a strange, garbled, crackling, and hissing sound and what I can only describe as guttural noises that didn't quite sound electronic but also didn't quite sound human, either. It wasn't like the typical kind you hear from a bad connection. If I had to describe it, it almost sounded organic. I asked again, 911, "What is your emergency?" And after another moment of crackling and hissing, I heard a faraway voice that sounded like a child saying, "Hi." The child sounded very young, like maybe 3 or 4 years old. I switched into a more comforting tone to try to find out what was wrong. After all, calls dealing with children can be very difficult to get the correct information and location due to their age and the potential trauma they have witnessed. I tried to ask the child what was wrong, where they were, if they knew what their phone number was, a name, anything. For most questions, the kid replied with just childish noises, like they were thinking, and trailed off or didn't respond at all. I was getting ready to send out some units for a check at the address while still trying to get information from the child, and while I was radioing out some officers, I heard the little voice on the line say to me, "Don't send someone, I want to come see you." This was where it started to get eerie. I didn't tell the child yet that I was sending police officers, as I had only just dispatched out a unit, not even 2 seconds before they said that. I told the kid to stay on the line with me until the officer got to them, which was especially important since there was no callback number and no call history from that address, and I had no idea what was going on because the child wouldn't tell me or even respond to my questions. I started giving the child some direction, telling them that an officer would be there soon and that he would help the kid. The child said, "I want to see you," and the line went dead. Normally, we would call back. I tried to do the automatic call back, but as it had picked up no number, this didn't seem to work. My officer got to the scene a few minutes later and radioed me to verify the address and the street, so I gave it again. He calls me on his cell phone and tells me that particular street was a private road that only had 2 homes, one that belonged to a rancher and one that belonged to a retired couple in their 70s. Neither had any children located within their homes, nor did they know anyone local who had children. The address that was populated on the Ani/Ali didn't even exist. Because it was a child, my officer and a few more did some patrol in that area and some surrounding areas, but found nothing. It was one of the strangest calls I've ever taken, and I still think about it. I'm a strong believer in the paranormal, but having worked in law enforcement, I always approach it with a skeptical eye. There was just something unnatural about that whole call, sounds I've never heard before on the line and never heard in any situation since. If it was really paranormal or not, I can't say. It was just really weird. The admin area, you had 7 greenhouses encompassed by a fence and a large garage attached to it that was used to house greenhouse supplies. Across the lot from that, there is another garage for farm equipment. So a very large area for one lone security guard. Now this was a brand new contract, so I had no one to show me around and was basically tasked with creating security procedures for the other guards to follow. To that end, I was working 7 days a week, from 4 p.m. to 6 a.m., until I had everything ironed out. My first day, I did a walkthrough of the place with my boss and the farm owner, then was left on my own to figure it out. Thankfully, I did have a decent little office in the admin building, and they even had an 8-channel security system set up. So weeks go by, and nothing weird has happened, not even an off feeling. If anything, it was beyond peaceful. I figured out a good security routine and made a policy out of it for new guards to follow. After that, life was easy. Do my checks. Read Fanatic. Watch YouTube. Glance at the cameras. Repeat. I was doing just that at about 2 a.m. when I saw a black mass jump over the greenhouse fence. I bolt up, lock my office, and run down there, weapon drawn. Now that may seem like a dramatic response, but I should be the only person for literally miles around. The main road is the only way in by vehicle, and it's gated. Plus, the gate is right next to my office, so I would have heard or seen someone approach by vehicle. And foot traffic at that hour and in that location? Well, it's probably not the mailman. I get to the greenhouse area gate and quietly let myself in. I start checking greenhouses one by one. After about 20 minutes, I found absolutely nothing. I found the camera in question and looked around the area, but found nothing out of place. I end up doing my entire security check early just to be sure, then head back to my office. I plan to review the footage because the fence is 8 feet tall with an additional foot of barbed wire across the top. That in itself freaks me out because I've been outside for over an hour before I realized the only thing that can clear that jump is a mountain lion. So I hustled back to my office, but my monitor is black. No signal was found. The hard drive and the brand new DVR is fried. At this point, it's weird, but not necessarily paranormal. A few days go by, we get the hard drive replaced, and all is well. It's probably around midnight, and I'm doing my checks by the backside of the greenhouse area when, out of nowhere, a blood-curdling screams, and it's damn close. My body goes cold. This very well could be the big cat I suspected a few nights earlier. I find the nearest gate and let myself into the greenhouse area. Better in there than out in the open. But then I hear crying. Unmistakably female, diaphragm shaking, snot slinging, weeping. That's not a cat. I almost wish it was. But I have to look, that's my job. Now, behind the greenhouse area, there's a dirt road in front of the center field that circles all the way around it. This road connects to the perimeter roads for the 2 side fields. Think of 3 big circles arranged in the loose shape of a triangle with the greenhouses in the middle. Well, this crying sounded like it was coming from that center road. I start to approach very slowly, and I can still hear it as clearly as day. It's getting louder and louder the closer I get. It's almost nightmarish. Until it just stops. So I stopped. I stayed there completely still for quite a long time. But there was nothing. People don't just stop sobbing. There's at least sniffling, maybe that hiccuping when you try to catch your breath. But it just went from wailing to nothing in one beat. After that, I always felt uncomfortable toward that back field. I heard the scream several more times after that, always around midnight and always from that same area, but I never went to investigate after my initial experience. By this time, harvest has come and gone, and the fields are bare. I'm still needed, however, because they use the greenhouses throughout the winter. As the seasons changed, so did my responsibilities. Rather than patrolling the fields, my focus was on the greenhouses. Not just for theft but also for ensuring that the heaters continue to work throughout the cold nights. To this end, I took to parking my Jeep next to the greenhouse area so I didn't have to make the long trek through the snow from the security office to the greenhouses. I could see everything I needed from my driver's seat, and my Jeep heater was infinitely better than the little space heater in my office. I had a routine. Start the Jeep, get it nice and hot, then turn it off. I kept my windows cracked because security work at night is 50% listening for weird shit. I didn't have to listen hard. A loud bang immediately removed any drowsiness I may have had. Something just hit my vehicle. I don't get out immediately. I took a good look around, listened for footsteps, and checked my mirrors frantically. But there's nothing. Then it happens again. Bang! On the roof of my Jeep, and dirt tumbles down my windshield. Someone's throwing dirt clumps at me? I call my supervisor and explain what's going on. She says she's on her way and will be there in about a half hour, as she is working at another farm not too far away. I reached for the passenger seat and grabbed my spotlight. The big kind of spotlight has 1000 lumens and allows me to see the back of every field. The kind of spotlight that will land you in jail if you shine it at a plane. I hop out of my Jeep and climb on the roof. It had to have come from the backfield. I began panning back and forth with my handheld beam of daylight. I don't immediately see anyone, so I start with verbal commands. Come out, you're trespassing. Announce yourself, I'm authorized to use lethal force, yada yada. No response. I stay posted until my supervisor arrives. We decided to walk the perimeter of all 3 fields and found absolutely nothing. By this time, it's almost 3 a.m., and we were back in my Jeep, talking and smoking. Then, a whistle. Like that playful 2-tone whistle that says, I'm over here. My supervisor just gave me this look, seriously? I told her that's the kind of thing I deal with at this place. She stuck around for the rest of the shift, but nothing else happened. It stayed quiet until Christmas Day, when I picked up a shift for that sweet holiday pay. I also opted to stay in the office for the sake of my Jeep. That's when the music started. Long, flowing classical music that you might hear playing quietly at a fancy party. I listened. Then I stood up and listened some more. I walked to the doorway of the security office and stopped to listen again. It's still there. I stepped out, and it stopped. I pause in dead silence. I step back into my office, and I can hear it again. I poke my head out, and it stops. I lean back in, and it starts again. It was almost cartoonish. It went on for quite a while and gradually faded away. There's nothing in that old building that plays music. There was no radio, no PA systems, and no one had forgotten a cell phone. It wasn't my phone, as I had actually tried to record it but picked up nothing but white noise. I walked outside on the off chance it was coming from miles away, but nothing. I only ever heard that music on Christmas Day. After that, I had actually gotten permission to bring my husky to work, and he loved the farm, especially in the snow. But some nights, he wouldn't leave my side. He would actually growl at things I had no perception of. Which you know is strange if you own a husky. The strangest thing about that place was that you could just tell if it was going to be a normal night or not when you got there. Some days, the atmosphere was just different. A lot of other little things happened there, but those were the big ones. So, about 15 years ago, I was living in the high desert of Los Angeles County, going to college full-time, and working 2 jobs. One job was working security at night for a church with a large campus and a private school on the property. The property had entrances on the west and north sides. At night, we would close the gate on the north side and post a guy in a car to deter break-ins and direct any traffic to the main entrance. On the north side of the property, there were modular trailer buildings that were bought second-hand and used as classroom space. One of these buildings was the troubleshooter. Whenever I was stationed at the back entrance, I would get this strong feeling that I was being watched. I'm talking about hair standing on end, goosebumps, and paranoia. I was being watched, and I was not welcome. I wasn't the only one who experienced these feelings, it was most of the crew. Eventually, we got scientific about it. Whenever there was a new guy, we'd stick him back there for his first night and not say anything. A few hours later, we'd roll by to check on him, and the new guy would be getting really jumpy, or he would have moved the car out of line with the side of the building. Part of the job was making sure the doors of all the buildings were locked, and if they weren't, we'd have to check the building and make sure nobody was squatting. This particular building would have lights come on or flicker in the middle of the night, and chairs and desks would be moderately moved around in classrooms, just like crooked desks and chairs pulled out, that kind of thing. One night, when I was back there, the building had been locked, but when I checked it later, it was unlocked. Great. Now I've got to go in. By now, my skin is crawling, and I can tell whatever was in there was pissed. I radioed in a second guy, and we went inside. Upon entering the building, we quickly swept through with flashlights and cleared all the rooms. I didn't see a thing. We make our way back to the front door. As we're standing by the entrance, there is a loud, noticeable creak. Someone took a step. The room is empty, then there was a sound I can only describe as blowing air or wind. I quickly moved above the ceiling tiles from that classroom towards us. When it got right above us, it stopped dead silent. This wasn't the AC system. The duct system wasn't in that part of the ceiling, and it was shut off. We never ran so fast. I'm not saying it was a ghost, a spirit, or whatever. All I know is that something was in that building, and it felt evil. This involves a night security guard, so from another point of view. The leaders of the ghost hunt had gotten permission to enter an old, shut-down hospital, more of a clinic, in a small and remote town near their headquarters. The abandoned facility had a reputation, and this was why they first set up shop in close proximity to the clinic. The building was the constant target of vandalism and other nefarious after-dark activities. There were no well-defined ghost stories about the place, but it had a reputation for having a bad vibe. Word spread, and it became a bit of a hotspot for ghost hunting until it was finally sold and torn down to make way for a gas station. The ghost hunting crew we were with previously brought the same equipment and another member of staff with them. The bosses oriented the newcomers and gave us all the same rules: avoid talking if possible, stick to safe words, and stay together. This time we all rode in the same vehicle, a 15-seater van. We got underway, and immediately upon arrival at our destination, things felt creepy. Chalk it up to nerves, excitement, or an actual ducking demonic presence, your call. We were encouraged to use our own smartphones as audio and video recorders, and we even installed a few different anomaly detecting apps before our adventure that night. The night guard/groundskeeper met us at the gate and asked for our IDs. We'd get them back if we respected the place and didn't wreck or vandalize anything. Then, he actually joined us as we walked around taking readings and recordings. What essentially became a slow tour of the building was quiet and uneventful. There were piles of trash and broken bottles all over, and the smell of rot and mold permeated the majority of the place. As a side note, I was playing Last of Us at home in my free time. This fact did wonders for my imagination in this place that smelled the way I assumed clickers smelled. We were deep into the basement and had essentially explored every room in the building when the highlight of the evening played out. I was walking in a small cluster that was basically the 3 professionals up front and 2 rows of 4 people. So there are 12 people in total, counting the groundskeeper. My wife-to-be, my brother, his wife, and myself were in the back row, furthest away from the leaders, when one of the girls in front of us, a girl my wife worked with, screamed and cried that something touched her back, and it really hurt. She was wearing a tank top that exposed her neck, shoulders, and lower back. It was obvious right away that her back was scratched to shit. Small pricks and lines of blood had already formed, like she had crouched under a tree with low branches. Her back was dominated by long vertical lines of red scratches that were not there seconds before. We were behind her the entire time, and the clinic was lit enough to notice something like this long before her screams. We immediately called it quits and walked back to the parking lot as fast and safely as we could. The whole time, the girl was whining about how badly her back hurt. Under the light of the guardhouse, it became apparent that the scratches on her back looked like someone had raked their hands down her back. The marks even went below her belt line and into her pants. She said her legs hurt too, and she dropped her pants in the van, showing us that she was scratched from shoulder to mid-thigh. She cried the whole way home, and we declined going back to the hunter's place to see and hear the recordings. That girl stayed at our place that night and woke up screaming several times until the sun came up. She still had the marks in the morning, though the irritation had subsided quite a bit. I don't like talking about this one. It got too real, and I don't have a good way of explaining what happened outside the paranormal. She was far too clothed to have grazed anything that left these marks, and her clothes weren't damaged. I don't see how she could have been a plant, as my wife knew her, and she'd never hunted with us before. It didn't make sense, and I try not to fill in the blanks because it puts my imagination in a mode that's hard to get out of. The guys who led the expedition got in touch with my wife a few days later. They said that the recording didn't pick up anything strange at all until the girl screamed. Then the needles jumped all over the place. Readings stayed consistent and didn't subside as we quickly left that part of the building and exited the facility. They surmised that, based on the footage, recording, and matching time stamps, it looked like something followed us until we got out of the front doors. Grain of salt. They also told her the night guard had quit the next day.